The writers of the New Testament nowhere made the resurrection of Christ a matter for argument, but everywhere asserted it and assumed it. With it began that state in the history of Jesus Christ that was still continuing, his elevation to glory. They used it as a basis for three kinds of affirmations. The resurrection of Christ was the way God bore witness to his Son, designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. This theme was also prominent in the Acts of the Apostles. The resurrection was the basis for the Christian hope for life after death, and Paul wrote that without it that hope was said to be baseless. The resurrection of Christ was also the ground for admonitions to manifest a newness of life and to seek the things that are above. The writers of the New Testament themselves expressed no doubt that the resurrection had really happened. But Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians shows that among those who heard the Christian message there was such doubt, as well as efforts to rationalize the resurrection. The differences among the Gospels, and between the Gospels and Paul, suggest that from the outset a variety of traditions existed regarding the details of the resurrection. But such differences only serve to emphasize how universal the faith in the resurrection was amid this variety of traditions. As indicated earlier, the narrative of the Ascension is peculiar to Luke Acts, but other parts of the New Testament may refer to it. Such a reference may be made in the 4th chapter of the letter to the Ephesians. However, many interpreters hold that, for Paul, resurrection was identical with ascension. That, they maintain, is why he could speak of the appearance of the risen Christ to him in continuity with the appearances to others, despite the fact that, in the chronology of the Creed, the Ascension intervened between them. Session at the right hand of the Father was apparently a Christian interpretation of the first verse of Psalm. It implied the elevation, or, as the doctrine of pre-existence became clearer, the restoration, of Christ to a position of honor with God. Taken together, the Ascension and the Session were a way of speaking about the presence of Christ with the Father during the interim between the resurrection and the Second Advent. From the Ephesians passage, it is evident that this way of speaking was by no means inconsistent with another Christian tenet, the belief that Christ was still present in and with his church. It was, in fact, the only way to state that tenet in harmony with the doctrine of the resurrection. The Creed concludes its Christological section with the doctrine of the Second Advent. The First Advent was a coming into the flesh, the Second Advent a coming in glory. Much controversy among modern scholars has been occasioned by the role of this doctrine in the early Church. Those who maintain that Jesus erroneously expected the early end of the world have often interpreted Paul as the first of those who began the adjustment to a delay in the end, with John's Gospel as a more advanced stage of that adjustment. Those who hold that the imminence of the end was a continuing aspect of human history as Jesus saw it also maintain that this phrase of the Creed was a statement of that imminence, without any timetable necessarily implied. From the New Testament it seems that both the hope of the second coming and a faith in the continuing presence of Christ belong to the outlook of the Apostolic Church, and that seems to be what the Creed meant. The phrase, "the living and the dead," is a summary of passages on the second coming from several of Paul's letters, particularly Corinthians and Thessalonians. In order to complete the confession of the Creed regarding the glorification of Christ, the Nicene Creed added the phrase, "Of his kingdom there shall be no end." That was a declaration that Christ's return as judge would usher in the full exercise of his reign over the world. Such was the expectation of the Apostolic Church, based upon what it knew and believed about Jesus Christ.